Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. This week, I figured we'd talk a little bit about leadership reviews because that's what everyone's talking about when it comes to the party leaders after the last election. Two leaders in particular are going to face leadership reviews, that being Andrew Scheer and Jagmeet Singh. So we'll kind of take a look at how those dynamics play out. Most parties have some kind of a leadership review mechanism in their constitutions. The Liberals do as well, but it's only triggered in circumstances where the leader does not win the election, ostensibly. So they are largely spared from that unless the membership gets restive. However, with the Conservatives and the NDP, they have both scheduled some kind of a leadership review process in the new year. The Conservatives will be in April. The NDP, I don't know that they've set a date for that yet, but those will both be upcoming. And that's when party members, meaning the rank and file grassroots members who go out and buy party memberships, will get a chance to have their say on whether or not they think the leader needs to be replaced. We did, a few years ago, see this happen with Thomas Mulcair when he was leading the NDP. There was the leadership review where he lost, which was a very rare occurrence, but it was kind of a confluence of circumstances where the party kind of felt that he didn't really lead them very well in the election. His message was very unlike what they were used to, and he lost a lot of their seats and they went from official opposition to third party status. So they decided to let him go, and 2 years later, because it was a supremely drawn-out process, we got Jagmeet Singh instead. The Conservatives had their first attempt at a possible bloodletting earlier in the last week when they had their first caucus meeting. There was a possibility that they could have given themselves the ability to force a leadership review on Scheer using the provisions of the so-called Reform Act, which we will get to in a minute. And they chose not to give caucus that ability. So that's kind of by the wayside. But like I said, we'll delve into that in a minute. But they have ostensibly said, we're going to stick by Scheer for the time being, and they will let the grassroots members decide during the convention in April. The NDP will have a similar kind of a situation. They will have to vote on these Reform Act provisions during their first official caucus meeting. It's unlikely that they will give themselves that power either, because all parties like to give themselves the pat on the back and say we're a grassroots party and therefore we don't think MPs should have that power, which is ridiculous. However, that's what they go with. And so we're unlikely to see any kind of a caucus push against Singh either. That does mean that when their party convention rolls around during which this happens, we will have to see what kind of organizing happens around whether they want to replace the leader or not, or whether they think that he did a good enough job during the campaign and deserves another chance. So, with these Reform Act provisions, let's just cast our minds back to when this bill was passed, and I will be the first person to say that the bill was hot garbage, because it was an attempt to re-empower MPs and push back against the power of their leaders in a backwards way. And then when Chong accepted all of these revisions that essentially defanged the bill and made it fairly useless, it just kind of made for an even bigger mess, and there are bigger problems down the road because it just was not passed in a very good manner. So what the bill purports to do is give the caucus the ability to either force a leadership review, to have a vote on whether to expel members. to elect their own caucus chair, which most of them already did anyway, so that was kind of just a pro forma thing. And it doesn't really give MPs powers because they already had them. And that's one of the things that we have to try and remember. MPs already have this power, but they give it up voluntarily to the leaders because they are deferential to the leaders because of the way in which leaders are elected in this country, which are by membership votes. Other Westminster systems until recently held by the maxim that the caucus would choose the leader, meaning it's just the MPs in the caucus who would vote on who the leader would be, and also they could then turn around and fire that leader if he or she did not perform. And that's a good system because it creates accountability and it keeps the MPs empowered because they are the representatives of the voters in their riding. What happened in Canada, dating back to 1919, when the Liberals first came up with the notion of a delegated convention, is that it shifted that accountability. So when the MPs are no longer choosing who the leader is, they lost the ability to hold that leader to account when things went wrong. And when the leaders started realizing that they couldn't be held to account by their own MPs anymore, they started basically taking power and centralizing it because they had a democratic legitimacy from their grassroots members in order to be that leader and not the MPs. So we need to think about leadership reviews in this context. We've had our MPs give up this power that they already had, and now we are trying to use backwards mechanisms like this Reform Act to try and restore something that was never really taken away in the first place. That creates really bad ways in which we govern ourselves in this country. And it's allowed leaders to centralize their power, whether they're in the PMO or not. And so when we think about leadership reviews, we need to remember that we're kind of doing things in a very backwards sort of way. There is very little accountability that a grassroots membership can have on a leader because they're so nebulous and somewhat ephemeral. It's not the same bunch of people who bought memberships who elected that leader. It's a kind of shifting cloud, and now that the Liberals in particular have rewritten their constitution to get rid of paid memberships, it's basically an amorphous cloud of people who both choose and could choose the leader and who could decide to get rid of him or her if that was the case. There's not a lot of accountability to be found in there, and people think that it's democratic, but it's not really. It's like the illusion of democracy without it actually being democratic. So when it comes to holding a leader to account, we've stripped away most of the mechanisms by which to do that, and that makes it harder for us to basically either punish leaders when they go wrong or just hold them to account when they're not performing well. They don't have the same kind of fear of their own people turning against them that they would if the caucus were the ones who chose them and who could remove them. It can still happen that caucus members can create enough public pressure that the leader will step down. We saw this most recently in Alberta when Alison Redford was the premier, and a couple of members of her caucus basically quit the caucus and said, no, I'm done. And that kind of created enough public pressure that Redford read the room and said, okay, it's time for me to go. It's harder to do that in federal politics because the caucuses are so much bigger. And with this Reform Act that Chong put in, even if the parties had voted to give themselves this power to force a leadership review, they've set the threshold high enough that they need 20% of the caucus to basically publicly say, even if it's publicly behind the caucus room door, but they still need to have 20% of the membership declare themselves that yes, they want this review. And that can be a pretty intimidating bar for the caucus to kind of organize itself around. So it's an imperfect mechanism, and I think it's one that protects the leader more than it makes them afraid that they will be held to account. So that's one of the things I think we need to keep in mind. We need to stop relying on this notion that this Reform Act is going to somehow hold leaders in check, because it won't. And as we approach the leadership reviews in the new year, we'll have to see what kind of organizing takes place. With the Conservatives, because the convention is going to be held in Toronto, there may be a more motivated base in that area who will be more looking to hold Scheer to account, because he wasn't able to get almost any seats in the GTA, which is incredibly important for the electoral math. So they may decide that because Scheer wasn't able to resonate with voters there, that they need to find someone who can. And because they are the closer delegates to this conference, and they may be more motivated, so they may have more sway in terms of seeing Scheer ousted. We'll have to see. We'll have to see what kind of organizing takes place in the next 5 or 6 months up until that happens. And again, we'll have to see what that kind of conversation looks like in the NDP as well, particularly because even though Singh performed well in debates during the election, he basically allowed the party's organizational structure to collapse under him. And they might feel that that requires someone who can rebuild that for them if Singh is unable to. So these are calculations that the parties will have to make, but it's a harder one than if caucus were there to basically have a tighter hold on the leader, and they simply don't under the current way things are working. And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.